we're about out of time. I do have one observation. You worried about artificial intelligence. I'd like to report that this morning when I introduced Grant, I said he needs no introduction, and the sound system turned itself off. So just to be sure we have that information on this tape, I'd like to remind you, consider this a review. That Grant began his professional education at the University of Michigan, many years with large, important architectural firms, came to the University of Washington, was a faculty member in the 60s, had a brilliant career there, 30 or 40 years, an award-winning teacher, and published major books that are still referred to by architects around the world. He came here in 2000 and has been a colleague of ours ever since. And you might be interested in knowing that he is one of the architects who live here who was consulted and advised on the design of the new West Tower. I don't think there'll be a pointed arch there, but you may see Grant's skill.
Well, I should comment on that. I don't think, this is a very personal opinion, I don't think the West Tower ought to be built. I don't understand the reasoning behind it, but if it's going to be built, it's a beautiful design. It is intrinsically a superb piece of design, and there is that to be said for it. It's a wonderful design. I wish it weren't there, but given the fact that it will be, it's a fine piece of work.
As has been noted already, there are always many layers of decision making in something like this.
And many motivations.
And absolutely.
It's Notre Dame at Paris, of course, you know that, and it's had a lot of attention in the last few years. It's architecture, and architecture is often called an art and a science. And there's some truth to that, but what we're going to be talking about today, what I would like to talk about, is art that is a consequence of science, that is a result of engineering decisions and devices that are not necessarily intended as art, but turn out to be that. Talk today. An arch, as you know, is a simple form that works structurally by transferring the forces down through a series of compression units to a bearing below. And a vault is simply an arch prolonged in length. The Colosseum is of interest because it has vaulting running up the sides of the building, but also circumferentially, and they must meet somehow, and they meet as one vault intersecting the other, which turns out to have a seam of a sort that looks like the juncture of our leg with our tummy, and we call it therefore a groin vault. It has a considerable history in Rome. This is a drawing, a restored drawing, obviously, of the Baths of Caracalla. And both this and the Colosseum are rather ironic instances in that we're going to be talking about Christian buildings today largely, and these are buildings that whose relationship to Christianity is a rather dim one. Caracalla is reported to be the most brutal and cruel of Roman emperors, which is saying quite a lot. But you see here the groin, the seam, the diagonal seam that marks it as a groin vault and allows it to have both continual space perpendicular to the screen and space across the screen where the windows will happen. This was copied almost exactly for Pennsylvania Station in New York, the New York station of the nope, I've missed it. I had a slide in here and I've left it out. Was copied almost exactly for Pennsylvania Station in New York, And one of our losses, I think, was that space in its grandeur. This vault system, however, was not taken on at first in the construction of Christian churches after that considerable lapse of time that we call the Dark Ages that moves us into about the year 1000. And we find here, this is one of the Pilgrimage Road churches, Sainte-Foy, at the little town of Conques. Have any of you seen this building? Do any of you know it? Beautiful little building in a lovely town. It uses a vaulting system, however, that is rather behind the times in terms of Rome. It's just a simple tunnel vault, as is the major structure of that time, the monastery of Cluny. This has a long tunnel vault, the length of this enormous nave. It was the largest building of its time, circa something like 1100. And here you can see that the builders have put windows in just under what is a tunnel vault, and this so weakened the vaulting system that it collapsed, which is why I'm showing you a drawing and not a picture of the real thing. There's one transept left. I couldn't locate a decent slide of it. This will suffice. So that didn't work, but why am I going backwards? Because I'm pushing the wrong button. But about 11, what would it be? About 1100, the late 1090s, the Cathedral of Durham in England marks the point of beginning for a real answer to the problem of vaulting. This is Durham seen from across the river and its interior. And you can see here that it uses the groin vaulting system, considerable advance over the disaster of Cluny. This tells us also something rather interesting that isn't exactly engineering. You may be able to see at the far left edge of the image that column has decoration on it, and where one block meets the other, it's sometimes not quite aligned. It's been sort of scuffed into alignment. That tells us that all the parts were prefabricated. It was brought to the site as assembly and not as fabrication, and this will mark the entire history of this building type. Why? Because you can work the year round when you're prefabbing in the lodges, and you don't have to deal with weather. It's a simple matter of assembly and marking of the parts when it arrives at the site. This is a very important building because of its vaulting. It's early on in that type. This, however, is the major turning point. This is the Basilica of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, and I imagine some of you have been here, have you? A few, yes. It is now painted outside and in, which I rather carped at early on, and I'm going to change my mind about that a little bit, grudgingly, but so be it. This building was added to at the far eastern end from 1140 to 1144. We are here in the nave, which is a century later, and down there at the far end, that little tiny piece of architecture is the key to the future. This is a ring of chapels that was done in a new way with the groin vaulting system. This mason, for the first time, used not a round arch, but a pointed arch. And why is that of importance? It has become a kind of icon. You know, you walk into a small town in America and you see a building with pointed arch windows and you know it's a church. But it didn't begin that way. It began as a device to answer a problem. If you have a vaulting chamber, a space that you want to vault, and all four sides are equal, you can do it with a round arch and come out just fine. But if the spaces are not equal, the arch, as a round arch, has a geometric given, which is that its height is half the diameter. And therefore, chambers with unequal sides will have unequal heights of vaulting, and it would be a mess. What the pointed arch does is to break the rigidity of the geometry. It gives the builder any height he wishes for any span. And this means that if you have a chamber with very different sides, you can bring them all to a common altitude, and the thing is orderly and seems positive. This is one such chamber, and here you can see that the sides are not equal, but because of the flexibility of the pointed arch, all of them meet in a common keystone and a quite orderly system, and you here at the far eastern end get a series of spaces that are five-sided. The blackened far right end of this image is the chapels that were done by Abbot Suger from 1140 to 1144, and they are complex in form but orderly nevertheless. Suger wrote two books actually about the building of this thing. He said nothing at all about his master mason. He takes all the credit, which cannot be right. This is the work of an experienced mason of considerable ingenuity and considerable talent, with a working team and experience, and Suger is flawed for not mentioning him. My wife and I did a sabbatical in which we tried to find other buildings by this mason. We found 6, and we determined that he was the designer, obviously, of every aspect of this building for which Suger takes credit. This then begins the Gothic, the pointed arch, with its flexibility of geometry, its ability to handle complex spaces and unequal sides of vaulting chambers. This is the Cathedral of Laon. It's on a mesa, steep sides to this projection out of the Champagne region. It's about 30 miles northwest of Reims. And some of you may know that cathedral, perhaps a few of you know this one. I love this facade. I love it. Why do I love it? It's so complicated and so orderly, and in its towers are those oxen about which I wrote a poem. And I can't read it because my eyes are too bad to read the type, and I can't remember it because my memory is too bad to remember it, and Andy is too bandaged up to read the thing, and Bill Anderson is going to do so. Bill, would you read that
I will.
poem? Thank you.
This is.
I love it so. Yeah.
I'm sorry Grant can't read it because he would be a much better
Here
reader
are the
than I.
oxen.
But
Here are those lovely oxen in the towers of Laon.
there they are. The oxen of Laon. 9 centuries ago it was that weary. Excuse me. I better get my glasses out.
Now we take a little break. Yeah.
Okay. 9 centuries ago it was that weary teams of oxen, pulling tumbrels laden deep with stone from which arose the great cathedral, trod the paths that climb vertiginously from the quarries to the Collier de Laune, which is the cathedral. Many oxen perished on the paths, and legend tells us that at their demise, the Virgin sent celestial surrogates into the yokes. The noble figures in the towers of Notre Dame de Laune, the legend says, commemorate this miracle. But why, we ask, did Mary, in her mercy, not bestow upon the living creatures stamina sufficient to their struggle, saving thus God's gentle ruminants from wretched death and owners of the ruminants from ruin? We will hope then that those lithic oxen resting in the towers, non-yoked, unladen, are the medieval mason's salutation to those worldly teams whose weary toll enabled the cathedral on the Collier. Thank you, Grant.
He said I write poetry. I try to write poetry, which is a rather different thing. Well, I wanted to take that little break in our discussion because I'm so fond of this site, this building. This is the interior of Laune, and this is the first Gothic cathedral. This is the first building to have in its entirety a pointed arch system that yields this, I think, lovely space. Henry Adams, the author of Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, calls this the most delightful building in the Ile-de-France. And given the title of his book, that's quite a compliment. Those buildings aren't in the Ile-de-France, which saves them from comparison, but he finds it delightful, as do I. It's sited, as I've said, on this mesa, this elevated bit of land. We see it here from a bit of a distance. This was the Carolingian capital of what was then the bits and pieces of France. In about the year 1000, Hugh Capet established the Capetian dynasty and moved the capital to Paris. And there he decided, or someone decided, to make the cathedral in Paris outshine Laune. And so this plan of Notre Dame, Paris, a building that I'm sure almost all of you will have seen. It has 4 times the masonry of Laune. It's a much larger building, and it's intended, I think, to put down the efforts of that former capital in the Champagne. This is its plan: 5 aisles and large transepts. This is a section looking through it. And this, I must tell you, is not the way it was originally at all. And this makes a large difference. We call those devices that leap from the sides of the building up toward the top, we call them flying buttresses. And the ones you see here are not the ones that were originally put in the building. This is an aerial view. You look here at the apse end of Notre Dame, and you can imagine, you can't do otherwise, you can imagine the upper part of this without any flying buttresses at all. Let's in our imagination take them away. The upper reaches of this, when it was being built, began to show cracking in the potential for failure, and little braces were built along the upper reaches of this, and they were kept not quite solid because the weight was not wanting to bear on the chamber below. So they were open, arched props to hold up the upper reaches of this. They were quite small, and they became, of course, the support for the entire building, and we see them exploited for their design value at Chartres. It was built starting 1194. There was a disastrous fire, and this was rebuilt at that time as a almost entirely new structure. Its master mason, its original mason, saw the potential of these props that had happened at Paris, and used them to open the building to much more light. This mason saw that those could be a design device that would let him make large windows in the building, and it became, therefore, something more than just an expedient prop. It became a part of the architectural fabric. There we go. And so it yields spaces with these large windows that were quite unlike the small windows that were being braced at Paris. This uses the pointed arch throughout, and it is able, through the use of the flying buttress, to make those large windows that you see in the upper reaches of the building. I have changed my mind a little bit about the painting of these interiors. I was shattered at the painting when it was first done, because it washed out the windows that had been such an admired, cherished, loved part of Chartres Cathedral. Some of you may have seen it in its earlier days when the glass glowed with light and color. It no longer does, and I despise the painting of the interior for having washed out the windows. But I think now that this was a search for light. I think that these buildings, dark inside, were seeking to light the interiors, and therefore perhaps the light that comes through the lighter interior is as much a value in the experience of the building as was the glowing glass. How many of you saw this when the glass was glowing? A few of you, yes. One of the great experiences of Western art. So this uses the flying buttress, not designed to be an art feature, but it becomes that. The buttresses of Chartres. This became known, of course, to Paris, and Paris decided that it had to compete with Chartres in its light, and the entire upper reaches of Paris were rebuilt with much larger windows as you see it now. Those flying buttresses were used to open the entire upper reaches of the building, and so what you see of Notre Dame, this is work, by the way, of about 1250, much later than the original building of 1163 onward. I should have told you the date. This began in 1163, completed probably about the turn of the century, and then in the 1240s and 50s rebuilt with these wonderful flying buttresses that add so much to the drama of this building. It's a piece of wonderful, extravagant urban sculpture. They also did, at this time, that southern transept where that beautiful piece of glass has been now replaced. Some of you perhaps have seen that, the wonderful large rows of that southern transept that you see here facing the river. So Notre Dame, Paris, is the work of two very different periods. The early work of 1163 to perhaps about 1200, and then the 1240s and 1250s drastically rebuilt to yield the image that is so familiar to us and I think so loved. Something dropped. What was it? Amiens. This is the last of the seemingly successful Gothic cathedrals in France. You can see here that it has an extremely tall proportion to the windows, to the chambers of the chapels that you see here. Extremely tall, and the building, in fact, is on its interior wonderfully tall. 141 feet from the pavement to the keystones, and this is achieved by devices that I've tried to describe for you as engineering characteristics: the pointed arch, the groin vault, the flying buttress, and the ability to build such a structure. I've brought to you, and we're going to have plenty of time, I think, for questions, but there are some more points I'd like to make. I've brought this slide of the plan of Amiens. And what I'd like to have you look at here is the row of columns on the interior. Well, all of the black stuff that shows here, you see how tiny it is. Those columns that run down the center of Amiens must bear their weight within the middle third of the column. If you have a weight that's outside the middle third, the column will tend to buckle. These have not. That means that the engineer who created this knew from the laying of the first stones what was going to happen above, and he's worked it out with, I think, miraculous precision. Wouldn't you agree? I think so. It's astonishing in its delicacy, and achieved, as I've tried to describe, by devices that are practical engineering solutions to practical problems. Quite astonishing. I first became interested in the Gothic because of exactly this. I was so astonished at the unity of structure and aesthetics. One could not separate the one from the other. They are the same thing, aren't they? Exactly the same thing. And so Notre Dame, Paris, as you all, I'm sure, know it. I think you know it, especially from the events of this last 5 years. Amazing time, wasn't it, to have done this in 5 years, to have rebuilt it. Quite an astonishing calendar. This is not France, this is England. Pevsner, who writes books about every shire of England, an astonishing piece of scholarship, calls this period, of which this building is an example, the most outstanding creative architecture of Europe, although he says the English do not know it. This is Exeter. It's my favorite among the English cathedrals. And here I have to say, I'm not sure my argument of the pragmatic driving the artistic is entirely true. I don't know that all those ribs are working. But isn't it gorgeous? Isn't it beautiful? What a lovely thing. You see how the columns that are at the lower part of the image are a series of lines that become the lines of the middle part of the image, the arches that come over, and then the lines of the ribs that surmount the space. I find it beautiful. I find it beautiful. Now, there's another side to this story that has interested me, and it's not pragmatics or engineering. These spaces, these masonry spaces with stone and glass as their bounding surfaces hold sound. I had a student once who timed the reverberation time at Notre Dame, Paris, 9 seconds. A sound struck in that space could be still barely audible 9 seconds later. This means, of course, that music, sound in these spaces, will be automatically polyphonic. Da 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 dum pum. By the time I get to the last pum, the early notes are still hanging in the space. And this makes, I think, for the polyphonic music that is found within the boundaries of the Roman Empire and not elsewhere. And this heritage of masonry buildings, vaulted spaces that hold the sound, I think is intimately tied to the development of polyphonic music. It's simply not found in spaces that lie outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire, which is a strange but I think fascinating legacy of these spaces and of Rome. Rome is not my favorite city, but I must give it credit as the origin, really, of all that we've talked about today. And with that, I'm glad to talk about any aspect of this that you'd like to have me discuss. What would you like to talk about? What are your questions? You have none? Wonderful. Yes.
Can I reach that over?
Yeah.
When you were talking about prefabrication of some parts of the building,
Yes.
the
Durham.
picture you were showing showed
Yeah.
these immense columns.
Yes.
How could they transport? Would they transport the whole column at once, just with lots of oxen? How would they do it?
They bring it stone by stone, and maybe I can go back there. It'd be quite a trip back, but let's try to do it.
Yes,
Yeah, there it is.
The one especially the one on the left.
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
heavy.
Those are cut with the decoration in the lodge and brought to the site as finished pieces. And so it's only a question of assembly. How do they get there? The stones, as you can see here, are not really that large. You can pick out the typical stone, and they repeat. There are just the two types with the V and the single line. So they've developed a decorative system that is really quite manageable. The other columns you can see over on the right have different ornamentations. I think no two columns at Durham are the same. But this will continue right the way through the period we've been talking about. The ornamentation in the Gothic buildings is almost entirely pre-cut and brought to the site as a finished piece. It means a complicated means of, what do I want to say, of giving the buildings the stones their place in the building. When Reims was terribly damaged during World War I, the whole system of numbering of placement became known. The damage yielded a lot of information about the construction of the building, and each piece was numbered for its place. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, me? Perhaps you could elaborate a little on the significance of the ribs, as, of course, in Romanesque architecture, there were no ribs at the intersection of surfaces of the vaults,
Yeah.
and the ribs seem to be to enliven the building significantly. The last cathedral that you showed us, Exeter Cathedral, plays marvelously with the potential
Yes.
of the ribs.
You're absolutely right, and they do enliven the building. In the case of Exeter, they enliven it a great deal, but they originate also, I think, as practical devices. The ribs are set in place first, and the keystone set, and then the vault ribbing, the vault surfacing. If I'm correct about that, and I think I am, why don't you say a word or two again, Henry, about that? Or would you rather would you rather discuss it in terms of Exeter? Yeah, it's here. I don't know whether all these are structural. Do you know? Certainly the major ones are.
I wish I knew.
You wish you
I
knew,
wish
yeah.
I'd been there with the master masons,
Yes,
discussing
indeed.
how
Yeah,
it could all
yeah.
work together
Yeah,
in such a miraculous
yeah,
way.
yeah. They do a great deal to enliven the vault surfaces, but I think the ones in the major diagonals at least are structural. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Good question.
Grant, I have a question about, I'm over here in the corner,
Yeah. Hi, Bill.
about the organization of talent that produces a cathedral. These days, when we're building a building, such as the West Tower or whatever, we know there's somebody decides on whether to have it, where to have it, and who's going to design it, and who's going to build it, and who's going to supervise, et cetera. You mentioned in a couple of comments, and also in your poem, about the central role of the masons. Could you describe to me what the hierarchy of jobs are in a cathedral? And we have to recognize that these things took maybe 100 years to build. It's not something like today where a comment by a political official can have an impact in a matter of days or even hours. But how did that work?
I meant to mention it, and thank you for bringing it up. I should have discussed it when we were talking about the buildings. First of all, the Roman. Did I tell you the change from architectus to mechanicus, and the term architect dropped out of usage from Rome until really, I think, Christopher Wren and the 1600s. They were trained, nevertheless, the master masons were trained typically in a 7-year educational process. They had to know trigonometry to deal with the geometry of the buildings. They had to know simple arithmetic to deal with the billing and the costing, the payroll. They had to converse with the client. They had to be educated to a very considerable degree, and they were. They came through the cathedral schools as very educated men, 7 years of education, which perhaps not coincidentally is the master's degree today still in architecture. What else do I want to say about that? There's a film about Exeter that ends with the comment that the master mason of Exeter is unknown. I think the film intends to imply that these masters were unknown, and that is not at all true. The central point of these cathedrals was typically a brass plate that noted the master mason by name, and we only have anonymity because of the loss of many of those plates. We know them at Reims. They were Gaucher de Reims and who I should know them, Jean d'Orbay and Jean Leloup and Gaucher de Reims. We know them by name because the plate is still in place. And with Gaucher de Reims, local boy, we have the beginnings of the architect in practice, though not in name, because before Gaucher, the teams were itinerant. They would come, they would go, and they went from one site to another as the payroll became available. But with Gaucher, we have him there for 35 years. He becomes attached not to the building crew, but to the site itself, and thus is a prototype of the architect. Where was I? What did I not cover?
Well, you've covered a lot. Are there other questions?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
in the back.
Yeah. My speech isn't what it should be. My
We are
mouth is
delighted.
not what it
Grant,
should be. Yeah.
I'm wondering how in the world the flying buttresses that are out in the middle of the air were constructed and kept from falling down before they were completely attached.
Yeah, there was a New Yorker cartoon at one time that the mason was building this arch, and he was just building it out in space, and the caption was, "I don't know how we'd have done it without him." They're built on formwork. A wooden form is set up, and the arch is built on that, and only when it's completed was the formwork struck. That's true of all the arches, I think, without any exception, except for that one that the New Yorker commented on. Yeah. Yeah.
Grant, I had a question about
Yeah.
materials.
Yeah.
Since not all stone is created equal, what
Yeah.
kind of stones were used in the construction of these buildings?
Invariably local. You can pretty well tell from the names of the architects whom we know. Let's see, who was the one at Amiens? Robert de Luzarche at Amiens. Local people and local quarries. It was simply too difficult to embark on a lot of transport. At Chester, it's built with a sandstone that is really quite soft and has not weathered well. The same is true of Salisbury, where the limestone is available in very durable form. The buildings have lasted much better. Chartres is built of a limestone, nearby quarry at Berry, I think it is, that is very durable, very long-lasting, and the foundations of Chartres go right to bedrock, so it is going nowhere. I think it's true that the foundations at Amiens consume as much masonry as the entire superstructure. The French built on very solid foundations. I'm sorry to say, Henry, that wasn't always true in England. They built on the Saxon logs that weathered away, and you know the story at York. The entire tower had to be given new foundations in the 1960s. It was. Yes, so the stone was local, and the buildings benefited or suffered from that fact, but I think there's hardly a case where the source is other than a local quarry. Yeah.
Surprisingly, a number of cathedrals were built with stone from Caen, CAE in France.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
And of course, many towns were built on rivers.
Yeah.
The stone
Yeah.
was transported by river
Yeah.
across the channel after rivers.
I should have explained another aspect of this that I didn't. Suger wrote those two books about the building of Saint-Denis. At its consecration on June 10th of 1144, he invited every bishop in France and the Archbishop of Canterbury from across the Channel. He cites them all in his book, and in case you missed it, he cites them again a little later on and adds another one that he seems to have missed the first time around. But that was instrumental in the spread of the Gothic. It meant that within the next century, from 1144 to 1244, we had the rebuilding of almost every major cathedral in France into the Gothic style. The Gothic was not admired, or so they said, by the later ages. The Renaissance seemed to have not valued it. They certainly did not copy it, but the admiration, I think, is shown in the fact that there was no demolition of any of these buildings. I think that's true. Beauvais fell, collapsed, but that was because of a change in groundwater that undermined the foundations. Yeah. I didn't know the Caen stone brought across the channel, obviously, with considerable trouble. Must have been a remarkable limestone.
Other questions?
Yeah.
You know, when I look at the structure here,
Yes.
it feels like many of the parts of the structure are curved. How did they achieve that?
They did it by means of full-size drawings. They had on the site typically what was called a tracing floor, and we have it still. There's one at Wells and one somewhere else. I've forgotten the other site. They laid out the arch full scale and marked off the stones and cut to that template straight out. Yeah, full size drawings. Yeah. Do you know the other side of the tracing floor, Henry? There's the one at Wells, and I've forgotten the other one. There is one other. Yeah. Yeah. I should also give credit to the wood people. These buildings involved a lot of wood in their construction because every arch had to have a framework on which it was built. But they also contributed enormously to the interiors. The wood choir stalls, the bishop's chairs are gorgeous pieces of construction, of design and carpentry, and they should be given credit, which I haven't done. Were they oak? Again, it would be local. I think beech was not uncommon, but oak certainly would have been used widely. I don't know what it is at Exeter. That's a remarkably beautiful one here, and I don't know what it is. I'm sorry to say I don't know the material. It's a gorgeous bishop's seat.
Were there any real surprises in the rebuilding of the Paris Cathedral over the last few years?
Were there surprises? I don't know of any, but I found it interesting that the rebuilding was done in the same order as the original construction. The arches, the whole vaulting system was done from they built the roof first. They put up the walls and built the wooden structure of the roof and used that as a working platform to raise the stones for the vaulting, and only when the keystone was dropped was the great wheel moved on to the next site. And that was what was done at Paris in the rebuilding. They built from the roof structure down, and I was interested to see that the same sequence persists in the rebuilding of Paris. You know.
I'll bring it back. Oh. Henry?
These stone cathedrals are protected from the weather by a wooden roof above them. And so, of course, there had to be beams as wide as the cathedral. And, well, when Abbot Suger insisted on the dimensions of the cathedral he was about to build, he was told there are no trees tall enough. And Abbot Suger went out into the forest and showed them the trees that were tall enough.
Yes, yeah, he makes that claim, doesn't he? You pronounce it Suger. I call it Suger because I think the final consonant has been dropped over the centuries and perhaps was in place at that time, but I really don't know whether it's Suger or Suger, S-U-G-E-R. I was going to say something about that, and I've forgotten it. That doesn't happen to you, does it? No, I've forgotten it. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Grant?
Yeah.
Well, Rome had a unfair advantage in its the concrete and cement,
Yes.
and I guess it took us many centuries to catch up with that.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
so how what did they do with the Gothic cathedrals? Was there cement used, and did they have to use ingenuity to substitute for better cement?
Yeah, good point. Vitruvius, writing in the time of Augustus, sets down the formula for concrete, which was used in Rome, of course, extensively. The Pantheon is a concrete structure, as are the Baths of Caracalla, brick and a lot of concrete. Concrete is not, it's about 1/5 cement, and the remainder is sand and gravel, and the cement is a fired lime. But the buildings that we're looking at here used a rather poor concrete mortar sort of thing, and they swept it across the stone surface and set the stone in it to ensure an intimate contact across the piece. But they didn't use concrete for any other purpose than just the bedding of the stones that I'm aware of. We rediscovered it in the 19th century, as many of you know. I should have said, too, that Greece is often mentioned as not using the arch, that it was invented in Rome. That isn't quite true. The Greeks used an arch, but they used it just to tunnel their sewage system, and not, so far as I know, for any building above grade. But they did use the arch for that. Where were we? Does that answer that question, which I've now forgotten? Yeah.
Back to the abbot.
Yeah. Oh, Abbot Suger. Yeah.
I'm interested in the crossover, if there is any,
Yeah.
the intersection between the faith and the building.
The purpose for these buildings is not a simple thing to describe. Chartres was supposedly built after the fire because Mary wanted a more beautiful home. Fair enough, but the tourist industry was the staple economy of Chartres, and had they not rebuilt the cathedral, their economy would have plummeted. And so you can't just say that it's an act of devotion. The same is true in Paris. They were competing with Laon. They were trying to make a political point. And so the reasoning behind these buildings is often, I think, invariably a complicated thing. Yeah.
So there's a political and economic.
Political and economic, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gene?
Other questions?
When I was working to save old-growth forests in the Northwest, one of the things that we particularly liked hearing was something that I've not heard authenticated, but I liked it, and that was after the building of a particular cathedral in England, and I'm, like you, I'm losing the name of which one, that a whole patch of land was saved, particularly identified as where they would plant oak, I think, in order to have trees that would be 400 years old when they next needed to repair.
Yeah.
And if I don't know whether anybody else has heard that story. It was just those of us who were trying to keep old trees.
speaking of purposes for the cathedrals, I enjoy mentioning Salisbury. The bishop moved the site from Sarum to, I think it was a matter of something like 5 miles down to the river, the Avon, and built the cathedral there and set out the new town plan. He said he moved the site because it was a healthier place by the river. I doubt that, because I've been there in a mosquito convocation. But the truth is the bishop owned the land down by the river, and he made a fortune out of the move, if we're talking motivations for cathedrals. Yeah.
Grant, thank you very much for the talk. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you much. Thank you. Yeah. I should thank you. I enjoy doing it.